Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the scale of the challenge. Building something entirely new from the ground up.
Yeah, not just, a house or a business, but an entire country.
Right, after decades of just relentless conflict. Think about wiping the slate almost clean and having to invent everything from passports to plumbing systems. It's, mind-boggling.
It really is.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're continuing our exploration of Eritrea's remarkable journey. Now, this is part 3 of our 7-part deep dive into the source material you shared with us, charting that path from independent struggles to the nation it is today.
And it's really important context. If you're just jumping in here, you've missed the crucial history leading up to this point. Part 1 and Part 2 really set the stage, detailing the long fight for independence.
Absolutely. We strongly recommend going back to listen to those first. You'll get the full picture of everything that led to this moment we're about to discuss.
Definitely worth it.
So in this segment, we're drawing from the document titled Eritrea at a Glance, Part 3. And we're going to dive deep into those pivotal years right after de facto independence.
That monumental task of state building, the official path to sovereignty, this emergence of a new political movement.
And that unique philosophy of self-reliance, which, as the source notes, had some pretty astonishing results early on.
Right, and then the whole ambitious process of writing a constitution, and sadly, the devastating return of conflict.
Yeah. The document gives us a really detailed look at this period, doesn't it? Covering the provisional government's Herculean efforts, that landmark independence referendum.
The sweeping state reforms, the role of the new ruling party, these big national campaigns, and of course the border war with Ethiopia that, well, changed everything.
Understanding this period is absolutely key. It's foundational for grasping the challenges that shaped modern Eritrea. So get ready to see how a nation, starting from almost zero, tried to rebuild and define itself against just incredible odds.
So where do we even begin? That picture of Eritrea right after the war ended, May 24th, 1991.
That day marks the end of the 30-year liberation war. Independence was achieved, yes, but only de facto, right?
Exactly. It wasn't legally recognized internationally yet. They'd won the country. But now the immense task was building the actual state.
And the state of the nation at that moment? I mean, the document paints a picture of profound devastation.
Utter devastation.
Yep.
Infrastructure was just in ruins. We're talking water, sewage systems, barely functional, even in major towns.
It's hard to even visualize that level of destruction. The source mentions the few paved roads were torn up by heavy military vehicles.
Yeah, and Massawa Port, which would be crucial for any recovery, was badly damaged by bombing during its liberation back in 1990.
And this detail, it's just staggering. The entire rail system was dismantled.
Hold up, the iron rails were literally used to construct bunkers during the fighting. Just gone.
Economically, it sounds just as bleak.
Absolutely. What little light industry remained hadn't seen maintenance or modernization in decades. Urban unemployment was sky high, over 30% of the economically active population.
And the human cost.
Persistent drought meant the rural population was already on the brink of famine. At the war's end, a staggering 85% of Eritrea's 3 million people were dependent on donated food aid.
85%. It paints a picture of a population just barely surviving.
Just surviving. And when you look at the numbers the World Bank estimated for per capita income then, just $70 to $150.
Wow. Compare that to the average for the rest of sub-Saharan Africa at the time, around $330.
It really underscores just how deep the hole was.
So the challenge for the newly formed Provisional Government of Eritrea, the PGE, it was just immense.
Colossal. They weren't just rebuilding, they were trying to reconstruct this devastated infrastructure while building a rudimentary state apparatus from scratch at the same time.
Right, managing the transition to internationally recognized sovereignty with almost none of the basic tools a government actually needs.
Which brings us to that absolutely crucial next step towards formal recognition. The referendum.
Yes, the document details this process really well. After a year of intensive popular education, organization, logistical prep, quite an undertaking.
A huge undertaking. A national referendum on Eritrea's political status was held April 21st to the 23rd, 1993.
And the scale of the effort itself is remarkable. Nearly 1,125,000 potential voters registered.
And the participation rate, over 98.5%.
Incredible.
And this wasn't just happening inside Eritrea. People voted at polling stations throughout the country, yes,
Hmm.
but also importantly in neighboring Ethiopia and Sudan.
And across the global diaspora, too, right?
Yeah.
Middle East, Europe, North America, Australia.
Exactly. The sheer logistical feat and that level of engagement are just striking.
And the international oversight was significant, too,
Very significant. The balloting was monitored by the UN, the Organization of African Unity, the Arab League, the Non-Aligned Movement, and representatives from over a dozen countries,
including Ethiopia.
including Ethiopia. That inclusion was a powerful signal at the time.
And the outcome. Overwhelming, as you might expect, but still.
Absolutely overwhelming. 99.8% of voters chose sovereignty, a crystal clear mandate.
So, with that popular mandate, on May 24th, 1993, the PGE officially declared Eritrea's independence.
And recognition followed quickly. Key countries like Sudan, Ethiopia, Italy, the U.S. recognized them almost immediately.
And soon after, Eritrea took its place on the international stage, joining the OAU, the UN.
They had moved from de facto existence to legal recognized independence.
So they had the flag, the recognition, the mandate, but the real grinding work of building the actual foundations of a state was just beginning. How did they even start tackling that?
Well, once international recognition was secured, the focus really turned inward, managing that transition to constitutional government. They began structuring the government itself, clearly assigning distinct responsibilities.
Executive, legislative, judicial branches. The basic framework.
Exactly. And a really significant step was creating that 50-member Constitution Commission. This body was tasked with overseeing the entire constitution-making process, which was intended, right from the start, to be highly inclusive.
And what about administration on the ground? The document mentions restructuring.
Yeah, that's fascinating. They immediately tackled regional administration. The 10 old colonial-era provinces were restructured into 6 co-equal regions,
Okay.
and elections were held for regional legislatures. These new regional governments were given substantial responsibility for administration, reconstruction, development in their own areas.
So decentralization was key.
Very much so. Most development ministries, everything except foreign affairs, defense, justice, finance, and information, actually decentralized their operational functions down to the regional level.
Now, it's a real commitment to decentralization right from the outset.
Wow. And the civil service, also a major reform. Streamlining the structure, decentralizing management again, redeploying personnel out to regional offices. This actually resulted in a significant 30% reduction in the central public sector workforce.
Aimed at efficiency, presumably? Putting resources closer to the ground?
Exactly, putting resources where they were most needed for reconstruction.
It really hammers home that point about building from scratch, doesn't it? They weren't inheriting functional systems.
Not at all. They had to design everything for the new state. Think about the sheer administrative load. Creating passports, driver's licenses, designing telecom systems, developing school curricula.
Planning road networks, real networks eventually, establishing tax laws, trade policies, investment frameworks.
Literally inventing the entire machinery of a modern state, piece by piece.
So, with such a devastated landscape and this immense task ahead, who was leading this massive effort beyond just the formal government structures? And crucially, how were they engaging a population that had just endured decades of war?
Well, that brings us to the transformation of the Liberation Front itself, the EPLF.
Right.
In February 1994, the EPLF held its third Congress. And having achieved its core mandate, liberation, the delegates actually voted to dissolve the front.
Dissolve it. Okay.
From that dissolved front, they launched a new post-war political movement, the People's Front for Democracy and Justice, the PFDJ.
Okay, the PFDJ.
The stated goal was basically to build on the EPLF's legacy, using its organizational strength and popular support to lead the country through this post-war transition and into, well, a new era.
And what were its goals, as outlined in the source?
The document mentions the national charter adopted at that Congress. It summarized the basic goals: national harmony, political democracy, economic and social development, social justice, cultural revival, and regional and international cooperation. Pretty broad aims.
And how do they engage the population? That seems critical.
It was at the heart of the PFDJ's initial mandate, according to the source. A deep commitment to actively engage the population in national reconstruction, facilitate broad participation.
And did people join?
The document notes a remarkably high level of signups. In the first year, apparently up to 80% of adults in some communities joined local branches.
80%.
Yeah. And by 1996, this had grown to about 6,000 local branches across the country, each with around 100 members. That's a really significant organizational presence right down at the grassroots level.
So how did that grassroots engagement actually work? What did these branches do?
Well, initially they organized monthly seminars, to keep people informed and connected, but they apparently quickly shifted focus towards generating community-based development projects.
Like what?
Local PFDJ organizers got training directly from government ministries. This helped them support local initiatives like building schools or health clinics, and crucially, they acted as channels to communicate people's concerns and ideas back up to the state.
Interesting. So a two-way street, ideally.
That seems to have been the idea. And beyond this community role, the PFDJ also played a significant economic role, leveraging enterprises that had actually been developed during the struggle years.
Ah, so they had existing businesses.
Yes, inherited businesses involved in construction, well drilling, transport, shipping, metalworks, export-import, foreign exchange, even a housing bank. These became an important catalyst for post-war economic growth.
And the source notes something interesting about their role.
Yeah, it points out that these PFDJ-linked companies were often willing to take on local projects, maybe building a hospital or a school in a really remote area that private contractors might have found too difficult or just not profitable enough.
So a different kind of motivation there, tied to the national project itself.
Exactly. It speaks to that larger purpose.
And this ties directly into another key element the document highlights as central to Eritrea's approach, that philosophy of self-reliance.
Absolutely central. It was a core commitment. The nation would pursue self-development with dignity, relying first and foremost on its own people, their labor, their ingenuity, their commitment to set the pace and direction.
Moving away from dependency.
Precisely. Yeah. Taking control of their transition from colonial subjugation towards full economic sovereignty.
And there was a specific policy decision reflecting this.
A really significant one in 1995, ending widespread food relief in favor of a public works program.
Okay, how did that work?
Instead of just receiving handouts, impoverished Eritreans were employed in rebuilding projects, roads, small dams, terraces. It enabled them to meet their basic needs through work that directly contributed to the country's recovery. Food for work essentially became cash for work.
Dignity through work and rebuilding at the same time.
That was the idea. They also enacted a national service program, bringing young people directly into this nation-building process, often deploying them on infrastructure or agricultural projects.
And how did they handle international aid? Did they refuse it?
Yeah, refuse it, but managed it differently. International aid agencies operating in Eritrea were asked to integrate their activities into the national development plans, working under Eritrean leadership.
So, ensuring aid aligned with national priorities and reinforced self-reliance rather than creating dependency.
Exactly. And the document points to major investments being made during this time in education and public health specifically.
And this is where the results, according to the source, start to become, well, you use the word stunning.
Stunning is the word the analysis uses, yes. Based on the metrics cited for roughly the first decade or so.
Tell us more. What did stunning look like on the ground?
Okay, get this. The infant mortality rate was cut in half.
Cut in half. Wow.
Child malnutrition rates dropped by nearly 2/3. Life expectancy at birth rose dramatically from around 46 years to 55 years. These are huge public health leaps in a relatively short time, especially starting from such a low base.
That's incredible progress. And education.
Similar story. The number of schools more than doubled across the country. Attendance, particularly among girls, rose dramatically as well.
So that high level of popular participation we talked about, the community organizing through the PFDJ, maybe later the Warsay Akelo call, it wasn't just rhetoric.
The document argues it was a defining hallmark of Eritrea's post-independence growth and reconstruction. It translated directly into these tangible improvements in people's lives.
And it connects to other observations in the source, too.
Yes, like the reports of very low crime and corruption levels, described as potentially lower than anywhere else in Africa, maybe even the world at that specific time.
Suggesting a high level of social cohesion and civic pride.
Exactly, actively propelling that development process forward. It paints a picture of a society mobilized with a sense of common purpose.
So, alongside this urgent work of physical rebuilding and social development, the nation was also grappling with its fundamental legal framework writing that constitution.
Right, that 50-member Constitution Commission we mentioned, established early on. The document emphasizes its diversity.
How so?
Well, it had representatives from nearly all 9 nationalities, veteran leaders from the ELF, a key partner, sometimes rival, in the liberation struggle, and significantly, nearly half the members were women.
That's notable. And the process itself.
It was extensive. Starting mid-1994, the commissioners traveled widely, across Eritrea and also abroad to diaspora communities, convening discussions.
Discussions about what, specifically?
Really fundamental questions. The state's role in ensuring equity and social justice, how to structure leadership for sustainable development, the separation and balance of governmental powers.
Big picture stuff.
Absolutely. Exploring different forms of government, presidential versus parliamentary, appointed versus elected officials. The structure of the legislature, the place of the military in a post-war society, the role political parties would play.
Which civil and political rights should be enshrined and guaranteed.
Yes, and crucially, how to safeguard the rights of minorities and explicitly protect the rights of women. These were all on the table for debate.
And they sought outside input, too.
They did. They hosted an international symposium on constitution making in early 1995, bringing in expertise and perspectives from many countries. It underscored the seriousness they attached to the process.
And the goal wasn't just a legal document.
No, the stated intention, according to the source, was broader. To strengthen the existing national consensus forged during the struggle and deepen unity among Eritrea's diverse groups through this shared deliberation on the nation's future.
And they got creative with engaging the public.
Very creative. The document describes things like entire villages debating fundamental rights under shade trees, theater and music groups, staging performances on constitutional themes to make complex ideas accessible.
Making it relatable.
Exactly. Radio programs, broadcasting discussions in multiple languages, student contests to stimulate interest among the youth. It sounds like it was intended as a truly national conversation.
So after all that input, a draft was produced.
A draft came out in 1996, followed by another extensive round of public seminars across the country for feedback and refinement.
And then ratification.
Finally, yes. On May 23, 1997, a Constituent Assembly, 527 members drawn from the Provisional National Assembly, all 6 regional assemblies, and diaspora representatives formally ratified the document.
Establishing it as the legal framework for governing the country, paving the way for future national elections under its term.
That was the plan. It represented a major milestone towards establishing democratic governance.
So everything seemed to be moving forward, laying these foundations, rebuilding, developing, creating a constitution. But then the document turns to a much darker period.
Yes, tragically. Despite all this incredible energy poured into rebuilding and defining the nation, the source tells us tensions began to simmer with neighboring Ethiopia throughout 1996 and 1997.
Over what, initially?
Seemingly minor economic and political issues at first. But these tensions were significantly aggravated by a series of armed incursions into Eritrean territory, particularly from Ethiopia's northern Tigray region, right on the border.
And then something shifted dramatically.
It did. The seriousness escalated, and the crucial significance became starkly clear with the publication in Tigray in November 1997 of new maps.
New maps. Why were they significant?
Because these maps, for the first time, claimed significant areas of Eritrea as Ethiopian territory. This wasn't just about minor border disputes anymore. It was suddenly about core sovereignty and internationally recognized borders.
So diplomatic efforts failed.
Discreet diplomatic efforts failed to defuse the deepening crisis. And after a series of armed incidents, including the murder of several Eritrean officials near the disputed village of Badme, the situation just exploded.
Ethiopia declared war?
Ethiopia declared war on Eritrea on May 13, 1998, and mobilized its armed forces for what the source describes as a full-scale assault.
And the conflict escalated quickly.
Very quickly. On June 5th, Ethiopian aircraft bombed the airport in Asmara, bringing the war right back to the capital. International mediation efforts couldn't stop it.
And ground fighting broke out.
Yes, soon broke out at several points along the border, particularly in the west around Badme, the Central Front, and the eastern Buri area. It was a full-blown war again.
The human cost must have been immense.
Absolutely devastating. 3 main rounds of intense combat between 1998 and 2000 produced, according to estimates, hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides.
Hundreds of thousands.
And massive displacement within Eritrea. The document cites nearly 1 million Eritreans forced from their homes by the fighting.
1 million people displaced internally.
And on top of that, another 76,000 Eritreans and Ethiopians of Eritrean origin were forcibly expelled from Ethiopia, often losing everything they owned. It was just a tragic, devastating return to war after so much had been sacrificed for peace and rebuilding.
But the document does then outline the steps taken, painful as they were, towards trying to find peace and rebuild again.
Yes. With the war essentially stalemated after the third major Ethiopian offensive in May-June 2000, Ethiopia agreed to a ceasefire in mid-June. the fighting finally ended.
And a peace agreement followed.
Yes, on December 12, 2000, Eritrea and Ethiopia signed a comprehensive peace agreement in Algiers. This was a major diplomatic effort, assisted by mediators from the U.S., the EU, and the OAU.
What were the key terms of that agreement?
Several key components aimed at preventing a return to conflict. A 25-kilometer-wide temporary security zone was established inside Eritrea, patrolled by UN peacekeeping forces.
Okay.
Crucially, an international boundary commission with members approved by both sides was set up. Its job was to delimit the contested border based on colonial treaties and international law. Its decision was to be final and binding.
And compensation.
Yes, a separate commission was created to investigate civilians' compensation claims resulting from the war.
So once the Boundary Commission delivered its verdict,
It issued its binding findings in April 2002, and both parties had agreed in advance to accept them. After that, Eritrea shifted its focus once more,
back to rebuilding.
back to the immense humanitarian task.
Yeah.
Reintegrating the war-displaced civilians, those expelled from Ethiopia, returning refugees from Sudan, and also beginning the phased demobilization of combatants from the huge wartime army.
Integrating them back into civilian life.
Exactly, within a comprehensive, community-based reconstruction and development program.
And this focus led to another significant national campaign mentioned in the document.
That's right. In 2003, Eritrea declared the Worsay Yikalo campaign.
What does that mean?
It translates roughly as inheritor legacy. It was a call to the new generation, the youth, Worsay, to inherit the legacy, Yikalo, of the liberation struggle generation and commit themselves to rebuilding the nation.
And the symbolism.
The document uses that powerful image of Eritrean youth turning from their guns and tanks to shovels and tractors.
A shift back to development.
Exactly. The explicit aim was to revive the Eritrean economy, which had been absolutely devastated by the border war, just as it was starting to recover from the liberation war.
How?
By engaging the population, particularly the youth, through national service, in working on all economic sectors, rebuilding infrastructure, agriculture, services, a massive national effort.
And the source's assessment of this period, post-war.
It concludes this section by stating that the results of these focused rebuilding efforts were tangible. And generally speaking, progress was seen to be on the right tracks, at least as of the time period covered by this particular source document.
Okay, so let's try to bring this segment together. We've really unpacked quite a bit here.
We have. We've seen that immense challenge Eritrea faced right after independence in '91, a nation in ruins, but with this clear mandate for sovereignty, confirmed by that overwhelming referendum.
We looked at the ambitious, almost unbelievable project of trying to build a state from the ground up, restructuring government, reforming the civil service, creating the machinery of a country from scratch.
We explored the rise of the PFDJ, how it transitioned from the Liberation Front, its aim to engage the population in national life and economic development, and how it embodied that philosophy of self-reliance.
And we highlighted those remarkable early successes the source attributes to self-reliance and high popular participation, particularly those stunning improvements in health and education indicators.
Right, along with that inclusive, painstaking process of attempting to write a foundational constitution designed through national dialogue.
But then tragically, we also had to cover the devastating return of conflict with Ethiopia, the border war, its immense human cost.
Before finally touching on the steps taken toward peace, the Algiers Agreement, the Boundary Commission, and those initial difficult rebuilding efforts through campaigns like Worsay Yikalo.
So this has been part 3 of our 7-part deep dive into the history and development of Eritrea, drawing these insights from the source material you've shared with us.
And like we said at the start, if you haven't heard the first 2 parts covering the history up to 1991 and the long struggle for independence, they really do provide essential context for everything we've discussed here today.
Absolutely. We highly recommend going back to listen to those first if you want the complete picture. It really helps understand the starting point for all this.
Definitely.
And please stay tuned, because there are more episodes to come in this deep dive series. We've got 4 more parts, digging deeper. This journey certainly doesn't end in the early 2000s, and there are more layers and periods to unpack from the source material about Eritrea's ongoing story.
Lots more to cover.
So as we wrap up this segment, maybe something to ponder, drawn from these themes of resilience, self-reliance, and participation that the document highlights so strongly. Considering the sheer devastation they started with and the continuous pressure, the return of war, what does this period tell us about the almost unbelievable level of human will and collective effort required to forge and then try to maintain a nation against such challenging odds?